29-year-old Susan Poupart attended a party in May of 1990. Her mother had a bad feeling and begged her to stay home, but Susan brushed off her concerns and went anyway. 34 years later, her family is still looking for answers as to what happened that night. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This is my usual week off, the second week of the month, but I've found myself with a bit more time to work these days. My husband is taking a sabbatical of sorts to work on his own projects. So for the next few months at least, he has more time and has taken over a lot of the child wrangling duties that eat into my work week. With a little more time on my hands, I decided it was a good opportunity to do something that I was thinking about doing for 2024 anyway, but I just couldn't figure out how to make it work. And that was to start covering shorter unsolved cases on the second Wednesday of the month. Rather than taking the whole week off, let's use this spot for a little advocacy. To help me get adjusted to this new schedule, though, I did get help on the research on this case thanks to Sydney Pacha. Sydney is a graduate of the True Crime Podcast training course, which is a fully online course teaching people how to be true crime podcast researchers and writers. It's the how-to along with an education in ethics. I know podcast hosts who have had members of their team take the course, some hosts have taken it themselves, and many who want to get into podcast research as freelancers have definitely taken it. I would recommend it to anyone looking to start a true crime podcast or to get into the behind the scenes, because you will be miles ahead of everyone else if you take this course first. And I'll leave a link to it in the show notes if you want to check it out. It was developed by people who work in the field, so the information is staying fresh and relevant. So definitely check out True Crime Podcast Training. And again, a huge thank you to Sydney for this research. This case takes us to Wisconsin, and it starts with Susan Poupart, who is a member of the Lac du Flambeau band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Lac du Flambeau means Lake of Torches, and obviously it's not their name for themselves, it's French, and given to them by traders. It refers to their practice of night fishing, which made the lake look like a lake of torches. And this is often how tribes have gotten the names we know them by. Either colonizers looked at them and described to them, or they asked their neighbors what they were called. Like the Navajo. Their name for themselves is Dene, but Navajo comes from a neighboring tribe's description of where they lived, meaning fields next to a ravine. The Lac du Flambeau's name for themselves is the Waswaganing Anishinaabe. And they're originally, as in way, way back from the East Coast, but they moved inland along the rivers until they got to present-day Michigan, which is where they had long been settled at the time of European contact. In 1745, they moved south of Lake Superior to western Wisconsin, helping drive out the Dakotas who lived there. This has been their permanent settlement, and where they lived within this area depended on the season. In the spring, they would plant. In the summer, they would move to where there was good hunting and fishing. And then in the fall, they would focus on harvesting crops and gathering plants. Then they would hunker down in a winter camp with what they stored. In 1850, the Lac du Flambeau were present at Sandy Lake, which is a tragedy we talked about in the Tess White episode, which came out in October of 2021, if you want to check that out. I'm just going to give a quick overview here to help those who heard the story remember it, and for those who don't know the details, head to the Tess White episode to hear more. Basically, in 1850, the U.S. government tried to force the Ojibwe, aka the Chippewa, who lived in the Lake Superior area, to go west of the Mississippi to Sandy Lake, Minnesota. This was a move of nearly 100 miles or 160 kilometers. The bands refused to move willingly, so in February of 1850, President Zachary Taylor signed an executive order that ended their land usage rights, which overrode a treaty that said they could stay on their land. At the same time, the U.S. government also owed the bands money under two different treaties, so they basically said they would pay the money out, but only in Sandy Lake after the bands moved there. Now, this is what happens when one side has all the power in the deal. They will fulfill their part of the deal if you do what they say. When the Ojibwe got to Sandy Lake, the government purposely delayed the payment so that they couldn't just turn around and go back home. The plan was to wait until everything froze over, so the Ojibwe were essentially trapped at Sandy Lake for the winter. It would be too dangerous to try to make it back to where they lived in what is present-day Wisconsin. So they were told the payment would be there on October 15th, and thousands showed up at Sandy Lake for it. The agent making the payment didn't show up until November 24th, and he found people dying. They had run out of money to buy supplies. They hadn't planned on waiting over a month for their payment, so they didn't prepare for that. And the rations the government had given them to tide them over were, 1, insufficient, and 2, often rotten, which resulted in food poisoning and malnutrition. And then the agent didn't get permission to distribute the money until mid-December. By then, 170 people had died in those 2 months waiting on this payment. And the money was too little too late by mid-December. Winter had set in and they had no preparations to get through it. Some decided to just go ahead and head back to Wisconsin, figuring they were risking death either way. Between those who left and those who stayed, around 400 people died by the end of winter. This mass tragedy did stir public support for the Lake Superior Chippewa, and in 1854 they signed a new treaty that gave them permanent reservations on their lands. It also said that any payments owed to them from the government going forward would be administered there. This shows the power of a public uproar over an issue, and the Lake Superior Chippewa have been in the area ever since. Susan Ruth Poupart was born on November 20th, 1960, and grew up in Lac des Flambeaux, Wisconsin. She attended high school at the Flandreau Indian School in South Dakota in the late 1970s. Flandreau is one of only 4 off-reservation residential schools for Native students that's still open. That's out of the more than 520 schools that have existed in the United States. It began very much the way other boarding schools did, trying to assimilate young children away from their families. But now it is only a high school, and it runs much like any other boarding school. There is one source saying that Susan went to New Mexico after high school to continue her education, but she would eventually return to Wisconsin, being an active member of her tribe. She really had an interest in making sure Native youth were exposed to their culture, and she helped with a lecture series designed to do just that. Education and Native culture really were her passions, in addition to, of course, her children. When she was 20, she had a son named Jared, and then her daughter Alex was born when Susan was around 26. She was loving and silly with them, making sure they had whatever they needed, and giving them a lot of love. Another thing Susan liked to do was go out and have fun. She was very social and outgoing, and she loved just being around people. And that's what she planned to do one weekend in late May 1990. Susan, who was 29 at the time, had been invited to a going-away party on the reservation. Her friend's brother was enlisting in the military, and Susan was looking forward to this party. Her mother, however, was not. She told Susan she had a bad feeling and thought she should stay home instead. But she went, leaving her 9-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter with family to babysit them. The group first went out to a bar and then back to a house to continue celebrating. When Susan didn't come home, her family initially assumed she had slept elsewhere for the night, but then she didn't come home a second night, and that just wasn't like her. She wouldn't stay away from her kids that long, particularly not without touching base with the family who was watching them. So the family started looking for her pretty quickly. According to the Associated Press, she wasn't reported missing until May 30th. This is either a mistake in the reporting, or this was the day the formal report was dated, because we know she was reported missing by May 23rd, which is when the Civil Air Patrol aircraft came in to help do searches by air. There had also been, of course, foot searches for Susan using members of the community, the fire department, and even Susan's family. The reservation is big in land and water, but it's really like a small town. There are only around 3,000 people living there, and people know people. So the police were able to talk to people who were at the party and those who knew people who were at the party and get a pretty good idea about Susan's movements that night. Susan was seen leaving the party between 4 and 4:30 in the morning. Witnesses said she was seen leaving with two men who they identified as Robert Elm and Joe Cobb. And at least one witness characterized the situation as them forcing her into the car. The reservation did not have their own police force at this time, so the county sheriff handled the case, and deputies questioned Robert and Joe, who both admitted that they did leave the party with Susan. They said they were just giving her a ride home, and the plan was to drop her off there. But as they were driving, they got into an argument with her. Instead of bringing Susan home, they said they dropped her off near the Lac de Flambeau Elementary School. But it's not clear from the reporting if they claimed that they told her to get out of the vehicle or if Susan demanded to be let out. Regardless, both men said they had no idea what happened to Susan after they dropped her off. While the witnesses who said they last saw Susan with these two men were backed up by the men's own statements, the investigators did find that this was a well-oiled small-town rumor mill, so sometimes they would get a tip, say, from 3 people, but then when they looked at it, it all had one source. So they had to track all these down and figure out which tips were solid, and that took some time. But eventually, they got a third name of someone who may have known what happened to Susan, and that was Francis Fritz Schumann. According to witnesses, Fritz talked about being involved in whatever happened to Susan. And at least one witness came forward to say that Fritz came back to the house where the party was that morning after Susan had left, and he had blood on his shirt. Aside from witnesses, the police actually had very little evidence, and the searches for Susan continued through the summer of 1990. But as we have seen happen so often, it was hunting season that brought answers. On November 22nd, 1990, 2 hunters were making their way through the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. As they did so, they saw a purse and a jacket in the woods in an area where a bunch of logs were resting on each other. I'll put a photo of this area up on my website. I usually remember to put the link to the timeline for each case in the show notes, so just click on that and you can check out what this looked like. The items that were there looked like they had been pushed under one of the large logs rather than just being dropped and forgotten. Now, while jackets aren't super uncommon to find discarded in the woods, particularly during hunting season, purses are not usually found. The hunters went over to check it out, and when they pulled the jacket out from under the log, they saw a human jaw. They called the police immediately, and they were very quickly able to determine that these were likely the remains of Susan Poupart, and that's because her tribal ID was found at the scene with all these other items. Susan's dental records were then compared to the jawbone, and it was confirmed. From where Susan was last seen to where her partial remains were found was about an hour drive. She clearly didn't get out there on her own, but more than that, you have to wonder if she would have remained a Jane Doe had her tribal ID not been left with her body. They may not have connected the cases. Where Susan's remains were found was a common hunting area, and it is believed that one of the 3 persons of interest in this case was familiar with hunting there. I did mention that they only found Susan's partial remains, but that doesn't mean she was dismembered. The police have said they believe her bones were scattered by animals, so they must not have seen any evidence of tool markings on the bones. But something that they do note is that Susan's clothing wasn't scattered. and it didn't show signs of damage from animals. That led them to believe that Susan was left in the nude, with her clothing being dumped by her body, but separate from it. The autopsy could not determine cause of death, but it was ruled a homicide due to the circumstances of where she was found. Not only was her body found an hour away from where she was last seen and under logs, they found plastic and duct tape at the scene. They believe that Susan's body had been wrapped prior to being driven out to where she was dumped. Just like the cause of death, they could not forensically determine if Susan was sexually assaulted. They do believe that is a strong possibility since her clothes were separated from her body. The hope here would be that they could test her clothes for male DNA, but even though the clothing was left behind, it had been in the woods from May until November. The natural elements destroyed a lot of the forensic evidence, particularly what they would have been able to test for back in 1990, when DNA technology was relatively new. And with no evidence and just a few names of people seen with Susan, the case went cold. That's not to say it wasn't being worked on. It was, but the pieces just were not coming together. One tip that came from an inmate in Wisconsin. Based on what I can find on the Wisconsin court lookup, Fritz Schumann found himself in legal trouble with some frequency. And one time when Fritz was locked up, someone he was in jail with told the police that Fritz had confessed to killing Susan. And the confession given is in line with the main theory that has been going around the community, which has been covered in media Milwaukee. And that story is that Susan was taken from the party by force, according to witnesses, and Robert Elm and Joe Cobb were in the car, but it seems vague on when Fritz joined them. Once the four were away from the party, the men took Susan to an isolated spot and attempted to rape her. She resisted and fought back, but she was no match physically to multiple men. They physically assaulted her before raping her and then killing her. To try to shake out more information from the three persons of interest, in 2007, the state of Wisconsin held what is called a John Doe hearing. We actually covered John Doe hearings in another episode, not to give you more listening to do, but if you go back to the Hudson Family Home Murders episode from October 2022, they held a John Doe hearing in that case as well. These are not available in all states, but they're kind of partway between a coroner's inquest and a grand jury. Connecticut has a similar option that they call an investigative grand jury. These types of proceedings are overseen by a judge, and it gives the power to compel people to come in and testify. While they can always plead the fifth, the power of subpoena can often get witnesses to talk when they were otherwise hesitant to get involved. Unlike grand juries, John Doe hearings are not automatically private. They are, by default, public unless there is a reason to hold it in secret. The hope is to get more information to build probable cause to either look into someone specific or possibly it can lead to an arrest. 3 of the subpoenaed witnesses were Robert, Joe, and Fritz, the 3 persons of interest, and this is the first time they were named publicly. Robert showed up, but he didn't have an attorney with him, so his questioning was stopped by the judge, as he does have a right to an attorney. Joe didn't show up at all, ignoring the subpoena. Fritz did show up and pleaded the fifth for all of the questions. And it was in the questions he was asked that we got the information about his alleged jailhouse confession and the witness statement that he was seen with blood on him that morning. Unfortunately, no witnesses provided anything new or significant, so this basically did not help in the way they hoped. But it was worth a shot. In 2011, Susan's case was added to a set of cold case playing cards that were provided in jails and prisons in the state, with the hopes that someone who knows something will come forward. They've also sent evidence in for advanced DNA testing in 2014 and 2020, though it has not yet been successful. They've also had a long-running billboard campaign hoping to bring in tips. This case, though cold, has definitely not been forgotten. And Susan herself has not been forgotten. Her name is often included in conversations about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in 2019, she was specifically named in a Wisconsin state resolution proclaiming May 5th as a day of awareness for missing and murdered Native women and girls. This is the day, May 5th, that is often used in North America to bring awareness to these cases and, importantly, to the issues that surround them. Because beyond solving individual cases, we need to look at the issues surrounding these cases because that is how we fix things going forward. It is not because of genetics that Native women in America go missing or are murdered at a rate 10 times that of other ethnicities. It is not encoded in their DNA to have murder be the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women in the United States. There are many contributing factors to these, frankly, horrifying statistics. A lot of the root causes are the trauma and poverty brought on by government policies, but we can't go back to 1850 and start honoring treaties. What we can do is make actionable change now. A good example of recent change is the boarding school situation. Shutting almost all of them down and then allowing the remaining ones to honor Native culture was a big change, and it's already helped at least 2 generations heal. From a true crime/legal perspective, another thing that will help is investigating cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women with the fervor of a case where the media is watching like a hawk. We need to stop letting killers feel emboldened by police indifference towards certain victims. In 2021, the Wisconsin Attorney General started the Wisconsin Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force with the goal of figuring out what needed to happen to fight these statistics, both things the general public needed to know, but also what we needed to do to advise policymakers. The plan was to assess the response from social service agencies and also understand and clarify jurisdictional issues that they had in the state when we're looking at state, tribal, and federal government overlap, which is, again, something we've talked about before in the Ashland Mike case when they couldn't figure out how to issue an Amber Alert. The task force in Wisconsin is also looking to improve and implement data collection and reporting methods so that we have more information we can use when trying to figure out how to fix the root problems. Can we fight failed government policy with more government policy? Now, that's a question people like to yell about on social media. But when people are going missing and being murdered at rates 10 times greater than their peers of other ethnicities and races, it's time to try at least something. As for Susan's case specifically, these policies may be too late. The forensic limitations of the early 90s and the deterioration of evidence over the years may prevent a forensic solve in this case. So what everyone is hoping for is the fact that relationships change over the years. People who knew the 3 persons of interest may not have connections to them any longer, or to their families, or they might not seem as scary to them as they're aging. And people who, in the 1990s, had issues that may have caused them not to invite police scrutiny, like substance use, may be sober now and no longer worry about that type of involvement, and they're ready to talk. The investigators are confident that there are people in the community who know exactly what happened to Susan. This was not the work of a stranger passing through town. Susan was killed by a person or people she was connected to. Coming forward with tips is the best bet at solving this case. Even if you think your tip is small or you think someone else must have reported it already, you need to call it in. Hundreds of potential witnesses have been interviewed over the years, and it's possible the person with the key to this case has already spoken to the police. And if that's you, even if you held something back, or even if you outright lied to the investigators before, come forward with the truth. It's not too late. If anyone has information regarding Susan's case, you can call the Sheriff's Department at 715-479-4441, or you can leave an anonymous tip at the 411 tip line. There is a $20,000 reward for information leading to the resolution of Susan's case, and I'll leave the information on how to report your tips in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.